Hello! So I think we're probably about due for another opera story time. What do you think? So today we're going to be talking about Giuseppe Verdi's masterpiece in 4 acts, Aida, the grandest of the grand opera genre. Aida is iconic for its huge Italian sets and costumes and was actually commissioned by Cairo's medieval opera house. We've got Egyptian characters set in Egypt, performed for the first time in Egypt. The opera house itself was built to celebrate the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869, and the architecture was inspired by the famous La Scala in Milan. Aida was supposed to be the first opera performed in the medieval opera house, but unfortunately, all of the sets and costumes were stuck in Paris during the siege of 1870 during the Franco-Prussian War, so they ended up performing Verdi's opera Rigoletto instead. Finally, however, Aida did have its premiere on Christmas Eve of 1871 and was conducted by Giovanni Bottesini. Incidentally, the opera house sadly burnt down in 1971 and is now a concrete parking garage. But 17 years later, the new Cairo Opera House was built in another location. So from the very beginning in Cairo, Aida was a huge success. Verdi himself unfortunately couldn't attend the opera there for its premiere. Apparently he was quite upset that the audience was made up predominantly of invited VIPs like politicians and critics, but not members of the general public. So throughout his career, Verdi was a man of the people. He wrote for the general populace. He didn't write for reviewers or, political agendas. So actually he considered the European premiere in La Scala in 1871, where he was heavily involved in that production, to be like the real premiere. The opera was also an instant success in Italy and it took off like wildfire. It was very quickly performed all over the world. And today it remains one of the most performed jewels of opera. At the Metropolitan Opera in New York, it has been performed over 1,100 times, second only to La Boheme. With regards to the story, the libretto was written by Antonio Ghilanzoni, who also worked on subsequent editions of Verdi's other libretti, such as La Forza del Destino and Don Carlo. There is some conjecture as to where Ghilanzoni got the story. So some think it came from the French Egyptologist Auguste Mariette, who, fun fact, was buried in a sarcophagus when he died. Kind of baller. And others think the story is actually attributed to Temistocles Solera, who was another librettist who worked with Verdi on projects like Nabucco and Attila. So the opera Aida is set in the Old Kingdom of Egypt, which period spans roughly 2700 to 2200 BC. So, into the story. So there's a little bit of a Montagues and Capulets, Romeo and Juliet situation happening between the Ethiopians and the Egyptians. Act 1, we are in a beautiful hall in the royal palace of Memphis. It's very grand, there's lots of statues and nice plants, and through a really big, great door behind, we can see beautiful gardens and the pyramids in the background. There are two men, Ramphis, the high priest of Egypt, and Radames, a young warrior. Now Ramphis tells Radames that it looks like that the Ethiopians are again going to challenge Egypt by taking Thebes and the valley of the Nile. But the goddess Isis has now named a new commander of the Egyptian army who will lead them to victory. And he looks meaningfully at Radames and says, "Oh, the new leader, he's young and he's strong." It's like, oh, I wonder who he could be referring to. So Ramphis leaves and Radames sings alone of how he dreams of being chosen as commander and of his secret forbidden love for Aida, who is an Ethiopian slave who has been captured by the Egyptians. Il tuo bel cielo vorrei ridarti, le dolci brezze del patrio suore, una rega da seco sulle trimposarti, per gerti una trama, avvicino alle sole Aida is also in love with Radames, but what he doesn't know is that she's no simple slave. She's actually the princess of Ethiopia, and her father, King Amonastro, has invaded Egypt to win her freedom. Anyway, so Radames is all happy and in love, and in walks Amneris, princess of Egypt. And guess what? She's also in love with Radames. But Amneris, she isn't stupid, so she suspects that Radames is in love with someone else and that she has a rival, she just isn't quite sure who. So she asks him like, hey, like, why are you so happy? Why are you smiling at your phone? I might be the new commander of the army. So in peak awkwardness, who should come in now but AIDA? So both Radames and AIDA kind of must have like pretty terrible poker faces. So Amneris, she at first feigns kindness to AIDA, and she's like, oh, why are you so like awkward and upset? Come here, you're like a sister to me. But on the inside, she's like, and she kind of starts letting on how she really feels. And this conflict is suddenly interrupted by every man and his dog coming out onto the stage, because it's being announced that the Ethiopian king Amonastro is marching his army towards Thebes, and that Radames has been chosen by the goddess Isis to lead the army. What a surprise. So they all leave to take arms, and AIDA is left alone on stage. So here she's torn between her love for Radames and her father and her homeland. She joined in with the Egyptians calling Ritorna Vincitor, or return victorious, for the safe return of her lover Radames, but is horrified that she could have said such a thing, considering it would mean the bloodshed for her kin.
Ritorna Vincitor, e dal mio labbro uscì l'empia parola, vincitor del padre mio, di lui che pugno l'ormi per me, per ridonarmi una patria, una reggia e il nome illustre che qui c'è l'arme porto.
We finish the act with ceremonial practices and the swearing in of Radames. So we're inside the temple of Vulcan, lots of cool columns and statues of gods and like incense and stuff. So not so much is happening narrative wise, but the music is a bop. Like, check this out. So Act 2, we are in the apartments of the Egyptian princess Amneris. So she's surrounded by her slave girls who are dressing her all pretty, and they're all singing about how they're going to be victorious in the battle. But then Amneris sees AIDA coming and she's like, shh, shh. So she decides that she's going to get out of AIDA that she is in fact in love with Radames. So again, she pretends to be nice, but she's like, oh, you know, you must be so upset that we're currently at war with your people, but you know what, like, you seem particularly upset. Perhaps, is there a man you love who is in the battle? And AIDA kind of senses that she's up to no good, and she's like, I don't know what you're talking about. So Amneris pulls a sneaky move and is like, well, too bad Radames was just killed by your people. Now at this, AIDA cannot control herself and she's distraught. So Amneris has her like, gotcha moment, and knows that AIDA is in fact her competition. So AIDA first accepts this and she's like, yeah, sure, I'm your rival. And you know what else? And she almost reveals her identity as the princess of Ethiopia, but she stops herself just in time and she asks for forgiveness and says really that this love is the only thing that she has. But then they hear this triumphant music that signifies that Egypt is returning victorious over the Ethiopians. We then move to the gate of the city of Thebes, and everyone is there. So before, when I said everyone and his dog, now it's everyone and his horse, his camel, his elephant, you name it. So this is the triumphant march, and it's a very famous part of the opera and the wider operatic canon, purely for its spectacle. You know, it's tradition to have animals on stage as part of the procession, as well as huge numbers of people, like 2 choruses, you've got dancers, you've got extras, it's colossal. So the king of Egypt, he says, Radames, you did good. You can have anything you want as a reward. And at this point, the Ethiopian prisoners of war are led on in chains. Amonastro, the king of Ethiopia, is among them, but the Ethiopians don't know his identity. So AIDA rushes to her father, the king, and he declares to everyone that the king of Ethiopia, which remember that's him, was killed in the battle. Sneaky, sneaky. The Egyptian priests, they want all of the Ethiopian captives to be killed, but Radames uses the reward from the king to ask for their freedom. But I guess he was expecting for him to ask for something else, because he's like, oh, and by the way, I am naming you as my successor as king, and you get to marry my daughter Amneris. And then he decides to keep AIDA and Amonastro as hostages so that the Ethiopians don't try and avenge their defeat. So, I mean, it was kind of a fail, unless you're Amneris, I suppose. Act 3, my favorite. So we are now on the banks of the River Nile at night, and there's a big temple in the background. AIDA has planned secretly to meet with Radames, and she sings of how much she misses her home country. So she's expecting Radames to come, but it's actually her father, Amonastro, who comes first. And he's like, AIDA, I'm not a dummy. I can see that you and Radames love each other, but he's to marry Amneris. By the way, have you forgotten that they have, slayed and raped our people, including your mother? They took our land. Like, this is fucked up. Like, you're just a slave to them, and you've betrayed your own people.
Radames, so che qui attendi. Ehi Tama, lei conduce gli egizi, intendi?
Orrore, che mi consigli tu?
Giunque sorgete egizi e corti, col fuoco struggete le nostre città. Terrore, le stragi, le morti, e il vostro furore più freno non va. Lutti di sangue scorrono sulle città le vinti, fratelli allegri vertici, si levano gli estenti, cadi da messi e ridano. Per te la patria muore. L'ombra noi s'affaccia, trema le scarne braccia, sul chiamo tu allevò, uomo del re, ravvisala, e non sei mia figlia, tu devi fare tu sei la schiava
heartbroken, decides that she needs to choose her people over her lover, and agrees basically to honey trap Radames into revealing where the Egyptian army is. So when Radames arrives, they agree to run away together and to get married, and he ends up revealing where the Egyptian army is. But King Amonostro comes out of hiding, having heard the whole conversation, and he reveals his identity as king of Ethiopia. Radames, he's dismayed that he has betrayed a military secret to the enemy, and to make matters worse, Amneris and the high priest have just left the temple in the background, and they've heard this giant mistake, and they call for the guards to arrest the trio. Now in the kerfuffle, Radames, he takes on for the team basically, and allows AIDA and Amonostro to escape while he is arrested. Ooh, Act 4, final act. So we are now in the Temple of Justice. Now, Princess Amneris is torn. On one hand, she is furious that Radames is a deserter and he planned to flee with AIDA, the other woman. But at the heart of things, she really loves him and doesn't want him to be sentenced to death. She begs Radames to defend himself, but he refuses, saying that his life is meaningless without AIDA. Amneris, she reveals that only Amonostro was captured and killed, but they don't actually know where AIDA is. So Radames, he's hopeful that maybe she survived and made it back to Ethiopia. So Amneris says, look, I am going to save you, provided you never speak of her ever again. But Radames is like, no, I'd rather die. So Amneris, she's distraught and she feels immensely guilty that it was her jealousy that landed him in this situation. So next, Radames, he's led into his sentencing, but he refuses still to speak to defend himself. And then he's sentenced to be buried alive in a sealed tomb. It's harsh, right? Amneris pleads for mercy for him, but it's no use. The priests have already made up their minds. So she curses them. Now, curses in opera, they are a big, scary deal, and they definitely yield some of the most amazingly epic music. Check this out. In the final scene of the opera, we are with Radames alone, or so we think, in the tomb below the temple. Now the stage here is actually split, so we can see the temple above and the tomb below, which was actually Verdi's own idea. Now Radames, he dreams of AIDA and he hears a strange noise. Turns out that AIDA had a feeling that this would be his fate, so she preemptively went into the tomb to wait for him so they would die together. Tragically, the two accept their fate and sing until their oxygen runs out. Now I do intend on this video as being like a primer to the opera, and I hope maybe to opera newbies watching an epic like AIDA feels a little bit less intimidating now. But if you are new to opera, I have to mention, so much like came up in my previous Turandot video, be mindful that this was written in a different time. This opera is another that was inspired by Orientalism, which is inherently colonial and racist. And there is also the giant elephant in the room that this opera is still performed in many places today in blackface. But more and more singers are refusing this practice. At its core, AIDA is an opera that deals with the eternal difficulties of the human condition. You know, we've got love versus larger obstacles of power and authoritarian influence, love versus societal or political duty, jealousy, kinship and loyalty to one's people. We've got the concept of the other and the struggle of society's outcasts. Verdi didn't pay much attention to historical accuracy and he uses a very wide range of settings for his operas. We've got Rigoletto in Spain during the Renaissance, we've got Nabucco in Babylon, we've got Macbeth in Scotland in the 11th century, La Traviata in Paris in a time that would have been contemporary to Verdi. You know, you get the idea. It's not really about the setting, it's about the story. So the setting for Aida in the Old Kingdom of Egypt is not only very broad contextually, I mean, the opera could have been set within any of the literally hundreds of years of the Old Kingdom. But apart from the geographical mentions of Egypt and Ethiopia, I mean, there's nothing really inherently Egyptian about the story, which allows it in theory to be set anywhere. Verdi, he didn't care about the historical accuracy of the opera, rather he was focused on the emotion and the universality of the narrative. So to argue that engaging in an outdated and hurtful practice such as blackface is necessary for historical accuracy or believability is just like ridiculous. And if that really is a deal breaker, that someone on stage doesn't look Egyptian and it completely shatters the illusion of the whole opera, then guess what? You can cast some of the thousands of immensely talented black singers. Do I think that Aida is a museum opera that belongs in the past and it should be cancelled because it's racist? No. Do I think we should preserve the operatic tradition of blackface? Fuck no. Do I think that Aida is a musical masterpiece that beautifully exemplifies many of the complexities of the human condition in a way that's universal and can be adapted to continually challenge and inspire us? Yes. So that's it for today. If you got something out of today's video, be sure to leave a like. Let me know in the comments, have you seen Aida before? What was the production like? And do you have any favorite singers in these roles? Until next time, bye!